thinking about it, but just for a couple of minutes. We used to have a neighbour, and she was fairly old and living on her own at the time of that first lockdown. And because she was living on her own and had to isolate, she felt quite cut off from her community, from her family, from all the people she used to see quite regularly. And I'd see her sometimes over the fence, and I'd say, "Hello, how are you doing, Christine?" And she'd say, "I'm doing okay," you know. And I'd ask her how she was getting along, and she made a change. And the one thing that she changed about what she was doing in her kind of daily life was that she put up a bird feeder in her garden. It doesn't sound like a massive change. That's what she did. And she brought her chair out into the garden. She would sit and watch the birds feeding from the bird feeder. And she then later dug up part of her garden and put wildflower seeds down. And as spring turned to winter, she was happy just to sit and watch any wildflowers grow. It feels like many of us found our way back to nature over that lockdown period. Many of us returned to nature, and there were headlines about people leaving the big cities and going back closer to nature. But it may surprise you to find out that the idea that nature is good for us actually has a very, very long history. In about 290 BCE, for example, the Roman Jewish writer Flavius Josephus wrote about a remarkable feat of engineering that he came across during his travels in Babylon. He described a series of ascending tiered gardens, and each had unique shrubs and trees and vines. In his sacred texts, he writes that any attempt to describe it would be tedious. In this palace was erected very high walks, supported by stone pillars, and by planting what was called a pensile paradise, pensile simply meaning hanging, and replenishing with all sorts of trees, there was rendered the prospect of an exact resemblance of a mountainous country. Now, we now know this to be the hanging gardens of Babylon, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Josephus tells a story, and the story goes like this. He says, Nebuchadnezzar II, who was ruler of Babylon at the time, had married a woman called Amethyst. Amethyst came from a different part of the Middle East, from Medea, and when she moved to Babylon, she felt homesick, and she was often very ill. So Nebuchadnezzar goes around and calls all the physicians in Babylon and says, "Cure my wife," and they all fail. And Nebuchadnezzar eventually says, well, the only thing that's going to cure her homesickness is by bringing all the plants and shrubs and trees from Medea to Babylon. And that's why he builds the hanging gardens of Babylon, to try and cure her. Similarly, in the early part of the 19th century, many English cities very quickly became overcrowded as people moved from rural areas to towns and cities to find work, often having been squeezed off the land through the enclosure of farms. In London in 1848, for example, it was estimated that 1 in every 4 flat was overcrowded by about a factor of about 10. There were 10 times too many people living in 1 in every 4 flats in London in 1848. And one study even estimated that if you closed every door and window in a typical labourer's tenement in London at the time, the maximum amount of time that you could spend indoors was about 4 hours before you would start asphyxiating from the lack of oxygen. So the problem of overcrowding becomes more serious in the middle of the 19th century, and several remedies were tried. This is one of my favourites.
It's part of Baron's court, but there's neither courtyard nor garden, either at the back or in the front, for the babies of these West Londoners to romp in safety. But Mrs. Morris thinks her toddlers have a right to a place in the sun, so an out-of-this-world surprise awaits little Sally, who feels she's been given the brush off. From now on, it's high society and life in a penthouse for her. Baby, it's cold outside. Brother Paul is in on the secret, but poor puzzled Sally, little does she know how people are going to look up to her. Actually, Sally's not surprised. She knew about it all the time. Well, a girl can read between the lines of wire. After all, the whole thing stands out as a stand-in for a garden, so she's getting down to it. 2-year-old Paul's really above the age limit for this kind of cagey caper. Still, Sally gets a kick out of life when he's around. High life, it could go to a girl's head. It's Daddy. Yes, they respect him, even if they do sometimes look down on him.
there were so few gardens available, so few open spaces available, that baby cages became quite common in the later part of the 19th century. One idea was that by having these baby cages, you could cleanse the blood and purify the blood by allowing young infants to at least have some clean air to breathe. A much better solution was the creation of so-called urban lungs. These are large parks and large gardens that were used essentially to cleanse the air of cities. One of the earliest examples of this, or the idea for one of these, begins in the early 1800s in Derby. Joseph Strutt was the mayor of Derby, and he'd made his wealth essentially off the back of the working classes of Derby. And by the 1830s, he'd become worried that most of his workers were falling ill, too many, too often. And he said they need clean air, and they can't find clean air in the kind of cities and the smog of Derby. And so he became convinced that the way to solve the problem of overcrowding was to provide his workers with recreational spaces. And in 1839, he commissioned architects to design Britain's very first public park, Derby Arboretum, which still exists today. Now, the idea that you could have these that's Joseph Strutt, by the way. You could have this idea that you could have these green spaces acting as urban lungs very quickly became popular, particularly among the philanthropic class, who believed that they should give back to the working classes by having these wide open spaces that they could use as recreational grounds. On his death in 1887, for example, Joseph Whitworth donated about 18 hectares of land in Manchester to the city, so that it could be used as what he called a pleasure ground that would cleanse the air of Manchester. Known as Whitworth Park, is one of the largest public spaces available at the time, but that began to change towards the later part of the 19th century through the passage of the Public Health Act in 1875 and then the Open Spaces Act in 1881, which allowed local government for the first time to put aside funding to secure recreational spaces. Similarities were also spreading to America. In 1859, an American landscape architect named Frederick Law Olmsted happened to visit Derby Arboretum. Olmsted then went back to America, and particularly to New York, where he began thinking about this idea that the working classes had a right to go to public space, to parks and gardens. On his return to New York, he championed the idea of public spaces as the highest form of democratic order. He believed that everyone should have access to green space. Everyone should have the right to go to a green space. And on his return to New York, he led the movement for integrating green spaces into urban planning. Many of you will know Central Park in New York. That was one of Olmsted's first designs. Along with his colleagues, he also designed Prospect Park in Brooklyn and many other parks across the US. Olmsted's ideas were later formalized around the idea of what he called park systems, comprehensive park systems, which would be at the heart of urban planning. And it's still an idea that remains popular today. But back in the UK, the idea of park systems were later taken up by the Garden City movement in the early part of the 20th century. The Garden City movement essentially viewed nature as the most direct way to solve the problem of overcrowding and ill health problems that were occurring in urban centers. In 1898, Ebenezer Howard published what is perhaps one of the most important books in urban planning. It's called Garden Cities of Tomorrow, and it puts forward Ebenezer Howard's idea of what our cities could look like. The very simple idea that Howard was proposing was that all urban sites should have green space at its core. You can see the idea here. So he believed that we should all live in sustainable cities, sustainable urban areas which surround a core central park or a garden. And those cities should in turn be surrounded by green belts. And the idea is so simple that we place our cities in nature. And we use the natural environment to promote health and well-being, not just for one class, but for everyone. Everyone should have access to those green spaces. In 1904, Howard began designing Letchworth Garden City, but because he was reliant on wealthy investors, he had to make a number of compromises. probably the most important one was the idea that the town would no longer be run as a cooperative, but that they would have landlords. Howard hated the idea that landlords should be running a garden city. He also hated the idea that you could increase rent at any time in these garden cities. But this is one of the things the investors required. They also changed the layout of Letchworth Garden City. It was meant to be more organic in terms of how it used space, rather than Howard's vision of having nature at its heart. Letchworth slowly attracted residents, and many people saw it as a victory, as a kind of victory for the Garden City movement. Howard himself was unconvinced, and he became really frustrated with this idea that the Garden City no longer looked like what he envisioned. So in 1919, he bought some land in Welwyn, and he began designing the second garden city, Welwyn Garden City. Welwyn struggled to emerge as a proper garden city, probably because it was so close to London and you had lots of commuters who very quickly moved into the area. But the idea of the garden city, or the principles of the garden city movement, were taken up remarkably widespread across the globe. When New Delhi was being redeveloped in the 1950s and 60s, garden city principles were used to place nature at its heart. The principles were also used when Canberra was being redeveloped, when Quezon City in the Philippines was also being redeveloped. And you may have heard the last Tory government talk about garden villages for a time. There was a plan being mooted to turn some of the villages around London and the northeast into garden villages using the principles of the garden city movement. Now, the problems that the garden city movement tried to grapple with in the 19th century are even clearer today. For the first time in human history, a majority of human populations live in urban areas. In the UK, that's about 83% of us live in urban spaces. Unfortunately, urban life comes at a cost. It comes at a huge cost in terms of our physical health, including higher cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, lung cancer, lung disease, all kinds of physical ailments. And it also has a detrimental impact on mental health as well. People who live in cities are more likely to experience forms of depression, anxiety, stress, all sorts of mental health difficulties. Now, alongside all these negative effects, there's also evidence to suggest that we are spending less time in nature than at any other time in human history. One study suggested that the average person in Europe spends about 90% of their time indoors, and of the time that's spent outdoors, most of that time is spent traveling rather than actual nature. Emblematic of this shift is the fact that our children, my son's here now, I don't know if he's listening, our children are much better at recognizing characters on Pokemon and much better at recognizing and naming footballers, which he can do, than they are at recognizing common wildlife in the UK. They're not able to name very simple plants and trees and wildlife that you might see. Conversely, there is a wealth of evidence to suggest that contact with the natural world, contact with green spaces and other natural environments bring a wide range of benefits. I haven't really got the time to summarize all the evidence, so I'm going to tell you about some of the best evidence that we have. First, it's really, really clear that nature benefits physical health. People who live closer to green space, people who have better contact with the natural environment, residents of neighborhoods with better access to green space tend to have better physical health. They have lower rates of cardiovascular disease, lower rates of lung disease, lower rates of kidney disease. They're less likely to use emergency services. They're much more likely to recover quickly when they do fall ill. Many of these studies are epidemiological in nature, and because they are epidemiological in nature, they provide really conclusive and robust data. One of the best examples of this comes from Denmark. Now, Denmark has what they call the population register, which is a survey that's been going on for many years, and every year they ask different forms of questions. And one year what they had was a series of questions about physical and mental health. And what they were also able to do was to use satellite imagery to map where people lived, and because of that, they could also tell how far away people live from green spaces. And there were a number of these studies that used the Danish population register. Just one example of this showed that people who lived further away from green space tended to have about 60% more likely to experience some form of cardiovascular disease during their lifetimes. This was true whether a person lived in the capital city in Copenhagen, in a provincial town like Odense, or even in a rural area. The further away you live from green space, the more likely it was that you would experience some form of cardiovascular disease. Other studies using the population register, but also other studies outside of Denmark, have shown that simply living on streets with a greater number of trees reduces the likelihood of kidney disease, lung cancer, and heart conditions. Here's another example. This one's focused on your life expectancy. This is data from England from 2024. And what it shows is that for neighborhoods, or people who live in neighborhoods with the greatest amount of access to green space, having access to green space easily adds about 2 to 3 years in terms of life expectancies. In other words, if you live closer to green space relative to the people who live furthest away from green spaces, you can expect to live about 2 or 3 years longer. And this is true even after controlling for socioeconomic status and other things that you might expect to moderate this effect. In other words, simply having access to green space means we live longer. Similarly, greater time spent in nature is also associated with improved mental health. This includes lower rates of depression, lower rates of anxiety, lower rates of stress, and it also improves recovery from ill health. Let's use the Danish population register again. Remember, this is data from over 1 million people who have completed these surveys. One example of this research showed that children, again, who lived furthest away from green spaces had a 60% greater likelihood of suffering some form of mental ill health. And this was across all kinds of different conditions and across all the different regional areas in Denmark. Again, if you lived in Copenhagen, if you lived in a provincial town, if you lived in a rural area, didn't matter. If you lived further away from a green space, you were more likely to experience some form of mental ill health. And this was true across every single mental health category that you could think of. The evidence was strongest for things like cannabis use and alcohol use, but it also affected things like eating disorders, depression, levels of stress, levels of anxiety. The only one it didn't have an impact on was intellectual disability. Across every other mental health condition, living further away from a green space meant the risk of suffering some form of mental ill health increased, and the increase was largest for the individuals who live furthest away from a green space. Similar findings have also been reported in other countries too. In Spain, one group of researchers mapped the amount of green space in local areas within Barcelona. Again, using satellite imagery, and then they examined the impact on local people's mental health. One of the key findings in this particular study was that people who lived about 100 meters away from a green space had the most positive mental health. The further outside of 100 meters, outside this radius of 100 meters, the impact on mental health was dramatic. Mental health declined rapidly if you had no green space within about 100 meters of your own residence. But the study was also able to show something else that was interesting. They also found that the people who live closer to larger green spaces experienced a larger benefit in terms of their mental health. So it's not just about having green space nearby. It's about having good, large, open green space nearby. People who live closer to green space which is open and wide and expansive, are more likely to experience benefits in terms of their mental health. But it's not just epidemiological studies that show this effect. We also have experimental studies which do very similar things. One study in California asked participants to go for a walk in either a green space, which you can see at the top, and there are some images of the green space they went walking in, or they went for a 90-minute walk in an urban space, which you can see images of at the bottom. So very simple task. What they did was they asked participants to go for a walk. Some of them went for a walk in nature, some of them went for a walk in an urban space. And compared to the people who went on the urban walk, what they found was that people who went for a walk in the urban space firstly experienced more positive mood. They also experienced lower psychological distress. Other studies, they found even more remarkable things, that going for a walk in a green space reduces the levels of stress and anxiety, but also makes us feel more compassionate towards other people. Makes us feel more generous. We're much more likely to donate money to charity when we've gone for a walk in a green space. Makes us feel more patient, more self-disciplined. All these, the kind of qualities that we hope for and want, nice things in life, all the kind of things that are generated when you go for a walk in a green space. It's not just actual nature that has this effect. So my own research is focused on body image, and I'm interested in helping people experience their bodies and inhabit their bodies in a much more positive way, which some of you may recognize as a serious public health concern, given that the majority of people experience some form of appearance anxiety or body dissatisfaction. This is true across most parts of the world now. Fortunately, our work is showing that simply going for a walk in nature also helps to promote body image, more healthier body image. We feel better about our bodies. We're much more focused on the functions of our bodies rather than the appearance of our bodies when we've gone for a walk in nature compared to a walk in an urban space, which is excellent news. But what if you don't have access to nature? Well, one solution is to rely on what's sometimes called isomorphic nature. Isomorphic is a fancy academic term. It simply refers to digitized nature. So images of nature or films of nature or VR or augmented reality that includes nature. And our research is showing that exposure or contact with isomorphic nature has the same benefits, or more or less the same benefits, as real nature. I'm going to show you a short film that we produced using the green space in Grantchester. And we found that participants who watched this short film experienced firstly more positive mood, but they also experienced all kinds of other benefits, including more positive body image, lower rates of stress and anxiety, which is wonderful given that we can generate those effects very simply. I won't play the whole film, I'll just show you a very short snippet of it. If you want to kind of use the film for your own purposes right now, all you need to do is just to kind of imagine yourself as the person going for this lovely walk. A video like this seems to have a remarkable benefit in terms of generating all the positive effects we've been talking about, with one caveat. And the caveat seems to be that the effects, while they exist, are not as strong as real nature. We want people to get out into real nature when they can, but if there are reasons why they can't, if they have no access to real nature, or if they have low mobility, or if there are other conditions that prevent someone from accessing nature, isomorphic or digitized nature seems to be a useful backup. And beyond physical and mental health, nature has also a wide range of other benefits. For example, exposure to nature is reliably associated with improved subjective well-being. People feel more satisfied with their lives. They feel happier. They feel more positive about their lives when they live closer to nature or who have access to nature. People who live closer to nature also report lower levels of fear and anxiety. They report a higher sense of safety. They experience greater learning and capability, particularly in childhood. Having access to nature supports children's learning abilities. It's also been associated with improved imagination and creativity, particularly in childhood again. And adolescence has been associated with identity development, particularly in terms of helping children develop full holistic identities of themselves. It's associated with greater connectedness, not just to other people, but to all organisms. It's associated with non-religious spirituality. It's been associated with greater feelings of fulfillment in life. There is not a single other simple intervention that exists on Earth today that provides all of these benefits, this wide range of benefits, and for most people will be free. There is simply no other intervention that allows all of these effects to accrue. And the benefits of nature became increasingly clear during the COVID pandemic, like I mentioned at the start of this talk. And evidence from many nations showed that lockdowns had a detrimental impact on people's mental health, particularly rates of depression, anxiety, and stress all increased. And against that background, being able to go out and spend time in nature, even for a short period, seemed to act as a buffer against mental ill health. My colleagues and I tested this during lockdown in Austria. Austria didn't have as severe a period of lockdown as the UK, but they did have a lockdown period. And during one of those periods in April, I believe it was 2020, I forget when it was now, it feels like so long ago, 2021 I think it was, we asked participants to do a very simple task. They took part in a survey for a period of 3 weeks, and every day at multiple time points, we simply asked them, are you outside in nature or are you inside? How happy do you feel right now? How lonely do you feel right now? And how much screen time have you had in the past few hours? It's a very simple task. Now, what we found, this is going to be really nonsensical to most of you, but what it simply showed is that levels of happiness fluctuated over the 3-week period, which you'd expect. However, when people were outside in nature, they reported feeling happier than when they were indoors, which makes sense. The other thing you would expect is that people who felt lonelier were more unhappy. But if they were outdoors, they felt less lonely, even though they were on their own. And because they felt less lonely, they felt happier. And if they'd spent any time outdoors during the day, they were less likely to spend time on their phones or on their screens. And because they spent less time on their screens, they felt less lonely and therefore happier. Let's hope we never go into another period of lockdown, but if we ever do, the message is very clear. Allowing people access to green space use during periods of lockdown is a major buffer against mental ill health. So the question is, how does nature have these effects? In terms of our physical health, there are 3 main pathways that have been proposed. First, trees, shrubs, and other vegetation all have been shown to improve ambient air quality. And because it improves ambient air quality, it improves our physical health as well. So the idea that, going back to Joseph Strutt and Whitworth and other people who believe that gardens and parks could act as urban lungs, there's actually some truth in that. These large urban parks do actually cleanse the air. In the US, for example, it's been estimated that urban vegetation, so parks and gardens in inner city areas, despite only occupying about 3% of land, removes about 700 million kilograms of pollution every single year. And that's been valued at about $4 billion annually. So even though it occupies so little land, the economic and health and social value that comes from having vegetation in our cities is immense. It also works at a local level. If you want to cleanse the air, if you want better ambient air quality indoors, have plants inside your home. I am not a botanist. I do not know what the best plants are for indoor spaces. I have been told English ivy is really good. It's one of the best cleansers of pollutants indoors. Perhaps more important than air quality is the fact that if you have access to green space, you are much more likely to be physically active. The studies have shown, particularly among children, that if they have access to green spaces, if they have access to nature, they are significantly more likely to be physically active compared to if they have no access to green space, particularly at school, which is why it's so important for children who are younger age, when they have fewer capacities for decision making about where and when they spend their time, to have access to green space within the schools. Similarly, if you place green space in between someone's residence and their workplace, they're significantly more likely to walk or cycle to work compared to using other forms of transportation. One study followed over 1,000 participants in 4 European cities. So the 4 cities were Nantes, Porto, Sofia, and Copenhagen. And the study found that when participants had access to green spaces in their immediate surroundings, again, within about 100 meters of their home, they were significantly more likely to be physically active. And because they were physically active, they were healthier as a result. The study also interestingly found that the use of what's sometimes called green corridors, these are spaces, elongated spaces that include multiple ecosystems. So typically, things like canals would be a good example of a green corridor. And if those green corridors were reachable within a 10-minute walk, people were significantly more likely to be physically active again, and they were therefore likely to accrue the benefits of being physically active. And finally, the availability of green space also appears to improve social cohesion. It helps build local communities, and so shared values. People feel a sense of belongingness. People feel a sense that their life has meaning through their local communities, and through that, again, improves physical health. Some of the best evidence for this comes from studies of tree canopy coverage in Chicago. You wouldn't expect tree canopy coverage to be associated with crime, but in Chicago it is. If you live in areas with greater tree canopy coverage, you would experience lower levels of crime, irrespective of your socioeconomic status. So again, controlling for or taking socioeconomic status out of this equation, if you happen to live on a street with trees, you are less likely to experience crime in those neighborhoods. And the idea behind this is that when you have green spaces, when you have trees or you have parks or you have places that people can visit for nature, people are much more likely to come into contact with each other. They're much more likely to come into contact with each other, which helps to form what we call social units. Imagine we all go to the park together, and I see you regularly enough because you're my neighbors. Now we're all starting to feel like we're all part of the same social unit, so I want you to be my friends. And now that we're all friends, we're going to help build this community up together. That's what people have been finding consistently in Chicago and New York as well. When you have access to green space in local communities, people are much more likely to be invested in those communities, which drives down rates of crime. In terms of mental health, there are two main psychological theories that have been proposed. The first one is known as attention restoration theory, first proposed by Rachel and Stephen Kaplan in the 1980s. The theory is quite complex, but I'll try and give you the simplified version. The simplified version is this: when you're doing something that's cognitively taxing, like you all are now, you're all sitting here listening to me, that requires effort. That's cognitively taxing. Or anytime you're doing any work, for example, if you're sitting at home, you're doing any kind of work that requires cognitive effort, where you have to think about what you're doing, you have to focus, that is mentally taxing. And with prolonged use, your ability to focus gets reduced all the time. You get mentally tired, mentally fatigued, in other words. So basically, anytime you're expending your attention, you become mentally fatigued over time. Now, Rachel and Stephen Kaplan also proposed that you could recover from that mental fatigue quite quickly through a number of environments that they call restorative. Now, they claim that restorative environments have a number of different properties, but probably the two most important ones are firstly that they provide an escape from the reality of your work right now. Look, if this is mentally taxing right now, if you're feeling really tired and you're struggling to focus, the quickest way to do this is to find an environment that's restorative. And a good example of a restorative environment, according to Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, is a natural environment. And the reason why natural environments are restorative, according to them, is because they are softly fascinating. There are things in nature that attract our attention, but do not require effortful, meaningful, or deep thinking about. Imagine seeing the sunset. There is a lot going on here. There is color, there are sounds if you were actually there. There is the smell of the ocean. There are all things that are happening, and they're attracting and they're fascinating for you, but it doesn't require a lot of effort to think about. And there's a lot of effort, a lot of research to support attention restoration theory, and showing that they help to improve restoration and improve cognitive abilities. In one study that's typical of the studies that are conducted in this area, Danish children were asked to go for a short walk, either in a green space, you can see the space that they went for a walk in, or they went for a walk in an urban setting. And it was a 30-minute walk. And what the researchers found was that relative to the children who'd gone for a walk in the urban setting, children who'd gone for a walk in the green setting had better attention spans, better reaction times on tasks, lower levels of distraction. They also scored better on proofreading tasks when they were given those tasks to do. So just a 30-minute walk seems to have this ability to restore our cognitive efforts. But you don't need a real walk. You can do the same thing just by looking out a window. Studies at universities have shown that students who have access to a natural view of the natural world through their windows tend to feel more energized. They tend to score better on their end-of-year exams compared to students who have no views of nature from their windows. Likewise, residents of high-rise towers who have views of nature again report feeling more socially cohesive in their blocks. They report greater social cognition. They report better proofreading scores, etc. If you don't have views of nature, the same thing works with images of nature or films of nature as well. The second theory was proposed by Roger Ulrich in 1981. Ulrich proposed that certain natural spaces, and particularly natural environments that have a view of the horizon or have a view of water, are perceived as safer, because in our evolutionary history, if you were able to see the horizon or you're able to see the water, you could see enemies or you could see animals that might have been threatening to us approaching. So it's encoded in our genes, according to Ulrich. We prefer views that have a view of the horizon or have views of water because they feel safer. And because they feel safer, they have an impact on our physiology as well. Ulrich proposed stress reduction theory, which is basically this idea that exposure to nature helps to regulate our levels of stress. If you're feeling stressed, what nature is able to do is help to regulate your feelings of stress, but also your body's physiological response. To test this theory, Ulrich ran a simple experiment. He asked participants to watch a 12-minute film, which was basically In 1980, this was considered a very stressful film. It was called It Didn't Have to Happen. I've actually found the film. You can find it on YouTube. You can watch it at your own time as well. It is not stressful by contemporary standards. It is basically a series of people going around the workplace and putting their fingers close to machinery like this. And the film just kind of goes, oh, don't do that. It's scary, it's dangerous. And at the end, there's some really bad acting of a person dying. But anyway, in 1981, this was considered a stressful film, and he exposed people to this stressful film. And after they'd watched the stressful film, he either exposed them to slides of natural environment or slides of an urban environment. And what he found was that participants who were exposed to the slides of the green space had lower heart rates, were sweating less, so better skin conductance, had lower muscle tension, had lower blood pressure, and they also subjectively reported lower levels of stress as well. All the measures that Ulrich used showed that people recovered more quickly from the stress of this not scary, stressful film, quicker when they're exposed to slides of nature compared to when they're exposed to slides of an urban scene. And more recent studies have also supported stress reduction theory. One study asked participants to use a VR head thing. What are they called? You know what I'm talking about. Yeah, headset. So they placed a VR headset on themselves, and they were able to explore a 360 film of either an urban space, a park, or a forest. Now, while they were doing this, they were not told that this was going to happen, but they received a mild shock, which was considered very stressful. Mild shocks in the field of psychology have a very, very long and dubious history, going back to Milgram, who forced people to get shocked and all kinds of bad things. Anyway, this was a mild shock. It was considered relatively stressful and occurred several times while they were doing this, and they didn't understand why. But they were also having their physiological responses measured at the same time. Now, what the results showed was that when participants were viewing the park or the forest, they very quickly returned to baseline levels of stress, but only in those two conditions. If they were in an urban setting, there was no real reduction in levels of stress. The remarkable thing about this study is that it showed that the return to baseline occurred within about 3 minutes. In other words, if you're exposed to a natural environment and you're feeling stressed, or at least have a mild stress response, your body recovers very, very quickly, within about 3 minutes of that stress effect. Whereas if you're in an urban setting, it doesn't respond in the same way. You're still feeling stressed after those 3 minutes. There's also a more indirect route through which nature has an impact on our psychological well-being. Studies suggest that people vary in the extent to which they feel a connection with or feel at one with nature. Here's a very simple task you can all do. All you have to do is look at these images and decide which one of these images best describes your relationship with nature. So, for example, if you feel completely disconnected, completely divorced, completely separate from nature, nature is not you, then you might choose the figure on the top left. If you feel completely at one with nature, then that's you at the bottom right. You feel completely at peace, you're completely at one with nature. This is an idea that's common in Western philosophy, that we can be disconnected from nature. We feel a disconnection from natural environments. And for most people, we are somewhere in the middle. And this fluctuates over time, but most people in the Western world feel a sense of disconnection with nature. We do not feel at one with nature. If you do feel at one with nature, or if you do feel a higher sense of connectedness to nature, you're more likely to experience greater happiness, greater satisfaction with life, greater feelings of fulfillment in life. All the kind of positive effects that we've been talking about are also accrued indirectly via connectedness to nature. Now, the best way to promote connectedness to nature? Spend time in nature. If you spend time in nature, you get all the benefits of nature, and you also get connectedness to, or feel more connected to nature, and that helps to sustain the effects of nature in the long term. But populations around the world also differ quite widely in how connected they feel to nature. Last year we published some work which was a survey of the levels of connectedness to nature in 65 countries around the world. It was difficult getting this figure onto a single slide. We used the UK as a reference point, essentially, for statistical analyses. If you're looking for the UK, it's down here. The UK is one of the most disconnected countries from nature. despite having quite high levels of access to nature at an everyday level. Most people in the UK have some degree of access to nature, which doesn't exist for many other countries. But despite that, we still as a population feel quite disconnected from nature, which requires urgent rectification. If people in this country do not feel as a population connected to nature, then there must be an underlying cause for that, which we're trying to work out. Anyway, there's a wide range of evidence to suggest that nature is beneficial for us. It is cost effective, it's cheap, it's easy to implement, which is why the NHS is now taking it seriously as a means of promoting better healthcare. But there's also a wide range of evidence to suggest that for multiple different types of population, having access to nature is beneficial therapeutically. For women experiencing breast cancer, for example, having access to nature has been shown to improve rates of reception to treatment. It's also been shown to improve rates of recovery. For older populations experiencing depression, having access to a garden, being able to garden, has been shown to lower rates of depression even without medication. There are all kinds of wonderful effects like these. But just before I finish, what I thought I'd do is kind of distill all the things we've learned about today in some simple tips that all of us can use in our everyday lives through nature. The first one might seem really obvious, but it's to spend time in nature. And I say this because sometimes we have individual agency, individual choices about how we spend our time. I mentioned earlier that most of us probably spend about 90% of our time indoors. And part of that is a choice that we make. We're making decisions about where we spend our time and how we spend our time. And we can make different decisions. If it's a choice between spending 10 minutes indoors on your phone and going out for a walk, your choice should be to go out for a walk. But I also don't want to make this about an individual choice, because it's also about political choices that we make as populations. In the UK, we have lost more green space since 1960 than at any other time in the history of this country. The most obvious example of this is the loss of private gardens. Most communities do not have access to private gardens any longer because many of these have been either privatized or have been lost to decking. We are decking over all our gardens to the extent that we've lost about 60% of private green space since 1980. That's a huge amount of green space that's been lost simply because people want to have decking in their gardens, or because most of these garden spaces are being privatized. If you come from the southwest in this country, you'll know there's an ongoing dispute about who has access to green spaces, particularly in Devon and Cornwall, because much of the land is now has been returned to private hands. And so historic routes, rambling routes, for example, through Cornwall and Devon, are now being lost to private hands. And there's an ongoing campaign to restore some of those historic routes. But it's not just those big campaigns. It's the localized campaigns where we lose green spaces because they're being used for urban planning or for the development of new buildings and so on. So when I say it's about a question of politics as well, it's a question of maintaining the green spaces that we do have and ensuring that those green spaces are protected so they can be used usefully by future generations as well. And when you do go out into nature, switch off, and by switch off I mean switch off your phones. Studies have shown that when people spend time in nature but spend that time on their smartphones or on their phones, they experience no benefit of nature. It's the same as staying indoors and just sitting watching TV. If you do go out, spend time being fascinated by the environments that you see around you, and if possible, try and be mindful. Being mindful in nature is a very simple thing. It sounds really difficult, and there are all kinds of things that you can go online and read about, but it's such a simple task. It simply means kind of understanding your feelings at any given point and not over-identifying with them. If you feel stressed, go and sit in nature and understand that you feel stressed and accept that you're feeling stressed, but don't say, I am too stressed that I can't do anything with my life. Sit and experience those feelings. And there's a very simple therapeutic task that therapists sometimes give patients who are experiencing depression, which is when you're walking from one point to another, look for nature. If you're walking from the train station to your office, look for the nature, because you will find it. It'll be weeds, it might be a bush, it might be a tree, but just to notice nature as you're walking seems to be really beneficial for patients who are undergoing therapy. And if you exercise, try and do it outdoors. Studies show that doing the same exercise outdoors is more beneficial than doing it indoors. Obviously, there are some limitations. You can't weight lift outdoors, but if you go for a run, try and do it outdoors rather than on a treadmill. Again, that requires access to nature, though. And finally, if you work with children, introduce them to nature at an early age. This is one of the things we're losing the most, I feel. And what I mean by that is that we don't introduce our children to nature often, or sometimes at least, because we're fearful of nature, we're worried about nature, we don't value nature in the same way that we used to. But studies have shown that the benefits of nature are cumulative. The more time you spend in nature, the greater the benefits. And for children in particular, if they spend more time in nature, what it does is allows them to understand which different types of environments, which different types of nature benefit them the most. And as children and as later as adults, they're much more likely to return to those spaces to find the benefits are still there. So introducing children to nature and helping them understand different forms of environment, different forms of nature, what those different experiences might mean, helps them to familiarize themselves with the experiences they might experience in nature, but also has a wide range of benefits, not just for them as children, but also when they grow up. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you've got any. And there are questions online as well.
Thank you. My name's David Lynch, and I'm a mindfulness teacher. And I wondered if you had any evidence around two things which interest me in terms of how I set up my programs. I specialise in teaching outdoors in green spaces, but I'd be very interested to know the difference between when I do a session in an urban park of Cambridge where there isn't much biodiversity, there's some green grass, there's some bushes, but actually there's nothing like what you've been showing pictures of, as opposed to when I hold programs in country parks where there is greater diversity, more trees and fewer people. So that's my first question. Is there any evidence to suggest there's a difference in effectiveness? And the other one is that in my training programs, we're not only in nature, but I'm asking people to stop talking and to put all their focus on nature rather than interacting with each other in silence. So is there any, are you aware of any evidence which suggests that, yes, that does sort of increase benefit rather than just being in nature?
I'll give you the short answer. The short answer is it doesn't, but I'm going to qualify that. So nature exists on a continuum. At the kind of furthest end of nature, you've got wild nature, which is essentially forests and landscapes that are essentially untouched. And then kind of towards the other end, you've got what we call designed green spaces. So these are typically urban parks where there is some design involved. Studies of the general population generally show that there is no difference between designed green spaces and wild spaces in terms of the effects they accrue, with one exception: people who are very familiar with nature. If you already have experience of nature, it seems to be wild nature is the best to help you receive those benefits. So I guess for the people that you work with, if they're used to nature, I would suggest the wild spaces are going to be more effective. For the people who are just coming into your practice, it may be that there is no difference. The other thing to say is that a lot of these studies generally show that when other people are around, we do not experience huge benefits of nature. Other people are not nice, particularly when they're crowding green spaces. And we see this effect a lot in urban green spaces where people overcrowd, particularly when it's a lot warmer. When other people are involved, things go up, like levels of crime or low levels of crime increase. Overcrowding and contact with strangers increases, which makes us feel unsafe, makes us feel uncomfortable a lot of the time. Things like alcohol consumption increases, which again places people at greater risk of things like aggression and things. So when you have lots of people congregating in the same space at the same time, it diminishes the effect of any green space, which again goes back to this idea that if you can get out into wild green spaces, the effects are going to be much better. The difficulty, at least in the UK, is that access to those wild green spaces is incredibly limited. You have to really travel to find those green spaces now.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Hi, my name is Dorothy. I'm working in community mental health team for older adult, and many of my clients has mobility problems, and they don't see nature at all. So from your lecture, I am very grateful for your lectures, and thank you very much. because your comments that even watching the nature can be beneficial. So for me now is the topic of my future research, how I can improve well-being on my older clients who are prisoners of the house.
So one of the simplest ways to rectify that is through birdsong. A lot of studies suggest that even without the visual imagery, if you simply play birdsong, people feel like they're in nature. Birdsong seems to be so immersive. It has this effect that we think we're actually in nature, even though we might be sitting at home listening to it. And if you go onto the BBC Sound Library or Sound Archive, you will find birdsong of all variety. They've recorded all kinds of birdsong, and it's a wonderful archive just to sit and listen to if you've got the time. But yeah, I know there is a study that was published several years ago which showed that in homes for people of older age, having ambient birdsong being played seemed to improve mood, but it had to be varied. So you have to vary the birdsong all the time. It can't be the same thing every single day, but if you're able to vary the birdsong, it seems to improve mood.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. And I notice also that you miss Holstebro on the Denmark map. This is part of the city in Denmark. I was living there
Quite
for a
possibly.
while. So, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful presentation. So my question would be a kind of a critical evaluation on this. So environmental influence on mental health especially. So you have mentioned about two theories. One is stress reduction theory. So in this VR box, you said they used to give a shock.
Mm-hmm.
And may I know why? And that is the first question. And second question would be, I always have a questions why humans have internally connected with the nature. There is a famous hypothesis on biophilia hypothesis by E.O. Wilson, I guess, is a biologist. So we talked about some of the major points, which is that soft fascinations when we think about the mental health. And I don't know why we are. So for example, if I'm sitting and looking out of the window, I don't know what exactly I'm watching. I'm complete blank on the stage. I don't know why I'm doing that, but there is something in soft fascination. So I really think what your comments on that, yeah.
The reason why they shocked them was to increase levels of stress. It was simple as that. So you shock people, and that increases essentially your levels of blood cortisol, and that's a stress response. So if you receive a shock, you're stressed essentially. The biophilia hypothesis is a nice idea. It simply suggests that people feel a sense of an innate sense of nature or sense of connection to nature. There's a lot of debate about whether we do really have an innate connection to nature. What we can say with some reliability is that in the West, many people feel disconnected from nature, but in many other communities, particularly in Australian Aboriginal communities, for example, among Native Americans, there is a very different conception of this connection with nature. And they often talk about the idea of disconnection as something completely anomalous, that you can't be disconnected from nature because we are all part of nature ourselves. We're always in the same space as nature. And so the idea that you can be disconnected from nature is, to their minds, incredibly strange. That in turn has a huge impact on how they understand language around disconnection, language around connection to nature, language around oneness with nature. It doesn't exist in the vocabulary because it's not required. So when we think about disconnection with nature, we're often using it from a Western paradigm where we're talking about this idea that we can be disconnected from nature and that we can feel a sense of separateness from nature, which many other communities around the world may not experience simply because they don't see nature in the same way as we do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. Two quick questions. Is there any evidence for needing a memory of nature for the isomorphic stuff to work? And the second question is, why is there such a difference between French Canada and English-speaking Canada in the, you know?
in disconnection from nature, we do not know the answer. The other anomaly there was Brazil. Brazil has some of the highest levels of the natural environment, but the people who we surveyed were mainly from Sao Paulo and Rio, and even they have nature very close by, they seem really disconnected from it. And we think, we don't have clear answers to this, the degree of urbanicity, by simply which we mean how often you're in an urban space and how pristine or decrepit that urban space is, has an impact on your disconnection from nature, even if you are close to nature. Imagine if you live in a slum and you've got access to a park, but it makes no difference having this access to a park if your entire livelihood, your entire life around that is one of poverty. So it makes little difference unless you can also improve socioeconomic conditions more generally. There's also some interesting evidence coming from South America suggesting that even having access to green space doesn't ameliorate the impact of poverty, for example. So it's the underlying conditions that often matter more than access to green space itself. The question about memory is interesting. The short answer to your question is no. No one's tested that. But there is a lot of sociological work on the idea of what we call emplacement. Emplacement simply means feeling like you come from a place and having memories of that place, and having those memories itself acts as a health beneficiary. If you grew up in a space that was close to nature as a child, for example, and you've moved to an urban space in adulthood, you retain those memories of nature. And there is a lot of sociological work to suggest that people who have those memories of nature as a child want to return to those same spaces, or understand and have a pull, have a familiarity with those spaces. And even if they visit new green spaces, they bring those memories, and those memories have an impact on how they understand those green spaces again. Got time for maybe one more question if there is one? Otherwise, yes.
It's not actually a question, it's a plug. I'm a member of a group called Cambridge Nature Lovers, which people might be interested in. It's on Meetup. We meet up roughly every month and literally go out, usually at Fen Drayton Reserve, because the guy who runs it lives near there. We're meeting tomorrow afternoon at 4:30. We're probably going around identifying buds and looking at stuff, and I thought I'd just let people know about it. It's on Meetup. So yeah.
And it was called?
Cambridge Nature Lovers.
Awesome. Right, thank you all for coming, and go and spend some time in nature.